Have you testified? Now we're live. Really nice to have you, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for coming in. It is Friday, February 3rd in Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. And we have you for 15 minutes. Senator Harrison has spoken very highly of all of the work you've done to develop housing where it makes sense and engenders quality of life. And so we're grateful you're with us. If you just want to identify yourself for the record and talk a little bit about your work, and we'll try to leave a little time for questions.
She's one of our partners.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Elizabeth Bridgewater. I'm the executive director of the Windham and Windsor Housing Trust. And I just want to start by thanking you for inviting me, but also thank you for tackling this issue. It's one of the most important issues in Vermont, and you're on the tip of the spear of trying to solve this problem. So I really appreciate all of your work and thinking around it. For those that might not be familiar with the Housing Trust, I just wanted to spend a few comments just sharing who we are. We're a 35-year-old nonprofit. We're located in Brattleboro. We do have a shared office in Bellows Falls because we serve the Upper Windham and Windsor counties as well. Just to give you a sense of the scale of our operations, we own 859 rental units. That includes 36 single room occupancy units across 4 locations, 58 permanent supportive housing apartments in 2 locations, 3 mobile home parks containing 42 lots and 17 commercial properties. We have a current development pipeline of 6 projects in various stages that we predict will result in 159 new homes in the next 3 years. In addition, we provide homeowner education and counseling to about 200 participants a year. We steward 138 shared equity homes, and then we deliver a variety of home repair programs that are both in support of owner-occupied homes and private property owners of multifamily. I think what housing advocates have known for years is that Vermont has a housing crisis, and it's really gratifying to see that it has exploded in the general consciousness, and it's now front and center. It seems like everybody's talking about it. It's really exciting, and there's so much positive intention around the housing issues, and I think this is going to propel us forward to meet this challenge, but we also want to consider the best way to do this so that we're strategic and that public investments have a lasting impact for generations to come. The housing bill covers a lot of ground, and I'm going to focus on a few areas. The first one is the intention to increase density. This is something I fully support, and it makes sense to do that in locations where there's water and sewer infrastructure already located, where there's services and transportation, things that can be accessed by either getting to a major transportation route easily to get to jobs, or access by foot or bike for people that don't drive. This strategy also preserves open space, and while preserving the character of Vermont rural areas while creating more housing. The challenge is that water and sewer doesn't exist everywhere. And although towns do have some resources now to implement new, to create water and sewer infrastructure, we need the tools right now to create housing, because that is a more of a long-term approach. And I think increased density will help us do that. The other thing that I support in this bill is the intention to address the parking challenges, because parking can be a significant barrier when we consider new projects. In fact, when we think about a new site, the 3 threshold questions that we always ask right away is this site located on water and sewer? Can we get the density that's needed for a feasible project? And is there enough room on the site to get parking that'll meet the zoning requirements? I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for a statewide directive that tells municipalities they have to have a certain zoning requirement, but I am advocating for a directive that requires flexibility instead of just a blanket approach. And I'll share a story that illustrates why this is important and how flexibility can really work towards moving a project forward. So we are in the end zone of creating 27 beautiful apartments on the Connecticut River in Bellows Falls, the village of Bellows Falls, which anybody who's familiar with Bellows Falls knows has a very tight development pattern. This was ironically a former parking garage because Bellas Falls has had parking issues for decades. We demolished the building and built a new building in its footprint. It was a postage stamp lot, meaning the walls of the existing building were virtually where the lot line was. So there was no extra room anywhere. In order to get the density we went up one floor, but we didn't have any room for parking. We couldn't go into the basement because we needed that for the mechanicals. So we literally had no place to put parking. We did buy the lot next door in order to create a parking lot adjacent to the project, but it still wasn't enough. So what we did is we drew a circle around the building and we identified both municipal lots and private lots that were in a 5-minute walking distance. And when we applied for our zoning application, we suggested that we would have the property buy parking permits for everybody that lived in the building that didn't need the accessible parking spaces that were right adjacent to the entrance. This was welcomed by Bellas Falls, and our zoning permit was approved with that provision, with that kind of flexibility. If they had said no, and it was entirely in their right to say no, this project wouldn't have moved forward. We would have been reduced to no parking on site. Even with the adjacent lot, we would have had 12 units, not really a feasible number to build a new project. So Bellas Falls would have had a blighted building that had been sitting there for decades and no new housing. So it's a really wonderful example of how a town did step up and exhibit flexibility. And this kind of thing really should be encouraged, I think, at the state level. I also wanted to comment on the importance of the priority housing project designation. This is a really critical tool for us to streamline the permitting process. It allows us to avoid an Act 250 permit, which can, I don't want to say delay because the project is going through a process. It can extend the timeline to getting housing built is probably a better way to say it. And as a community housing builder, we really value the public process. So I'm not advocating for no public process. In fact, there's sort of capital P public process and then lowercase p public process, and we do both. We engage the community in a variety of ways. But streamlining permitting is going to be critical to solving the housing crisis. I think the bill does clarify that a neighborhood development area can't be appealed on character of the area, which is great. But that alone doesn't address what the real issue, which is the process itself. And so I really want to encourage a look at the process and how to streamline it and make it quicker. An example of this is our project in Putney. We're trying to build 25 new homes right in Putney Village. It's sitting in a neighborhood development area. The project meets all the zoning requirements. We didn't ask for one variance, including parking, ironically. It meets the goals that were laid out in the town plan. It meets strategic state goals for smart growth development. It preserves open space. We worked extensively with the community to actually design the site and get comment on the building. And in spite of all that, and after our permit was appealed, a resident appealed our permit. It cost them $250 with no attorney. The list of grievances, the majority of which were not relevant to the environmental court at all. So we had to wade through a list of 69 grievances that weren't in the jurisdiction of the environmental court just to pare it down to the one grievance that was in the jurisdiction of the court. A year later, we still haven't, pardon me?
Can I ask a clarifying question? When you said a neighbor, were they adjoining?
Yeah.
Were they an adjoining neighbor?
They have to be. They have to be in a butter, don't they, Elizabeth?
They
Yeah,
don't know.
They're a renter that lives in an adjoining affordable housing development project that's adjacent to the project.
Okay. Okay. I was just, we want to know exactly where the bottlenecks are, you know, if,
Yep.
if it can be helped, and even the jurisdictional question, that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is my first appeal, honestly, and in the beginning, I was somewhat naive about how it was going to go, and we're co-developers with Evernorth, and Kathy Byer warned me that it doesn't really matter what the substance of the appeal is. It's because the process takes so long, it can be an effective tool to slow a project down, and in some cases, stop a project altogether.
And you know, just to say out loud, I don't think we want to make it so costly and so attorney heavy that someone can't do it. You know, so I'm just listening to the bottlenecks that I think we would be able to address, like, you know, we don't want to make it so only rich people can appeal, but we also want to hear if anyone can appeal and sort of put anything through, how long does that delay it? What happens to you after that? What does streamlining look like?
Yeah, I think it's the timeline is so stretched out. We're literally almost 12 months in and we don't even have a court date. And
yeah,
so we spent probably 6 months just going back and forth to whittle down the number of concerns that were articulated by the appellant to get it to something that could be reviewed by a judge. And we've been now waiting probably 4 months we're just basically waiting in line, and there's no sense of when that is going to go before the environmental court. So I think, like I said, I'm not advocating to shut down a public process. I think it's really important. And I agree with you around the equity issues of we don't want to set up a situation where only rich people can afford to get their concerns heard by a third party. But I think there really does need to be a streamlined approach to this to make it quicker and get these things resolved faster.
Yeah.
I mean, may I just tag on to that? I mean, you know, the Stafford Common Project in Woodstock is the poster child for this. I mean, we were delayed by the appeals, one after the other with a pro bono lawyer, and it took us 10 years to build that project.
So people can also stack appeals.
They can stack appeals, and the timeline for each one is
one
endless.
court and they appeal to another court and appeal.
Right.
Well, we last year brought Judge Zone, and you recall the discussion that we had. He's the chief superior judge. And we had put in a provision to add some money to the economic development bill to hire an additional judge and to hire an additional clerk to help the courts. And they did not want it and felt it was an intrusion into judicial authority for the legislature to tell them how to do what they did. And they said that they didn't really need that additional judge. That's still left unresolved as far as I'm concerned about why does it take so long and what can be done to expedite it. And I think that's a question that we ought to ask again, and perhaps ask Judge Zone to come back and visit with us as to say, is there anything that can be done to expedite the process, or is there anything that can be done in statute to expedite the process?
Yeah, good. That's a great suggestion.
I really
Sorry,
appreciate it. No, it's great to listen in on what the history is about this and to think about how we can move it forward. I mean, we're in a good situation where we have a patient seller who was willing to work with us, and so that we could maintain site control, but not every seller is able to do that. And sometimes they're just not able to withstand the length of time. And so, these projects can fall apart when they're involved in these processes. So speeding it up is critical. I also wanted to comment on the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, the VHIP program. It was really great to see it in the bill. I think we've been engaged in this program now for going on 3 years. And we believe that it's a really important tool in the toolbox to solve the housing crisis. When it was first created in the first round of pandemic funding, it wasn't called VHIP, but it's virtually the same program. We estimated 25 projects. We just didn't know what the demand was going to be. We ended up completing 79. And so that really showed us, one, how many vacant units there were out there that needed repair, and how willing private property owners were to engage with us in the process. Our current grant agreement, which runs through the end of 2023, aims to rehab 100 units of rental housing. And in February, we already have a pipeline of 118. So again, we're seeing tremendous demand for the program, and the number of projects that far exceed what we have for funding right now. So I think your focus on this is welcome. And I see Senator Clarkson.
Yes, Senator Clarkson.
Elizabeth, would you just chat with us about the ADUs, which are a funding piece of the VHIP program. And we specifically funded navigators and people and the intention is very clear in the bill last year that we wanted people to help people who are not developers, who are homeowners who want to do ADUs in their home and they may have no experience with development other than a renovation or something. You have a person who's dedicated to this. I've met him at a couple meetings, would you be kind enough to share with us how that has been delegated to the 5 housing partners, which you're one of our 5 statewide home ownership housing partners? Anyway, could you share with us how that piece of the VHIP program is working for you, how many ADUs we have in the pipeline, and if one person if this is a good delegation of the navigational authority?
Yeah.
And I just want to let Megan know we'll be with her at 9:20. So we have about 3 more minutes.
Okay. I think we actually were coincidentally meeting in a retreat yesterday. And so I had a chance to talk to all the homeownership directors and the executive directors of the 5 designated agencies. And I think that our concerns about the ADU are a little bit different than what you're highlighting. And that is that, when this program was first created, it was really directed towards helping people move out of the motel program and to incentivize landlords to serve this really hard to serve population. And the ADU.
Well, that was true for VHIP, but not ADUs. ADUs have been in statute for a long time.
And it's been added to this program. So we're seeing interest in ADUs created with these funds. So that's where I'm linking the two.
Right, but the language is very clear. It's not for people exiting homelessness.
Exactly. And that was the center of our conversation yesterday, that there's this sense of we're not clear on what the policy intentions are of the VHIP program because it's creating 2 very different directions with the funding. And so I think that's something that's caused a little bit of confusion. We are seeing a lot of interest in the ADUs, and I don't have the numbers, I'm sorry, for the whole state. I believe our numbers that we have.
No, but for you, how many, I know of at least 2 projects that you've got going because they're in Woodstock, but
Yeah.
How many ADU projects do you have in the pipeline? Do you know?
I
You can get back to us, sorry.
Yeah, I've got it on a spreadsheet and I'm just going to look really quick. I've got 1, let's see, let me just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, about 10 out of the 118.
And you have one person dedicated to doing that, working with the owner, right?
Well, we have one
He's-
person dedicated to the whole program. So that includes all the other folks that are also utilizing the VHIP funding.
Oh, to VHIP and ADUs.
Well,
Is there any? Oh, sorry. Maybe this can be taken.
Yeah, no, it's just a piece of our bill is housing navigation. So we need to figure out how we're delegating it effectively. Is it delegated effectively at the moment to the 5 homeownership centers, which is what Josh has chosen to do? So is that working? And how many projects are, what are the pluses and minuses? We need to understand that.
yeah, I think the
Because that's
concern that
in our
was
bill
voiced,
this year.
the concern that was voiced in our conversation yesterday was that ADU development can be really complicated because it's like developing a whole project, even though it's one unit, you're still going through all the different steps of a developer. And are homeowners capable of doing that adequately? Are they capable of the issues that come up with being a landlord? And again, from a policy intention, I think because the ADU funding, the incentive funding is embedded in this program next to incentives to meet homelessness needs, they feel somewhat competing in intention.
They're all designed to increase density in, as much as possible. And yes, they're very separate intentions. One is to create a unit which may not have existed before in a house, and one is to bring vacant and blighted properties back up.
I just want to give Elizabeth the opportunity to share any final thoughts. We've covered you with a lot of questions.
Sorry.
Is anything you didn't get
Yeah,
to?
I have one final point that I wanted to.
Yeah.
It does relate to the VHIP program, and that is that this I just read an article this morning in The Guardian that homelessness increased in Vermont at a higher percentage than anywhere else in the country. And
Mhm.
Yeah,
per capita, we're the second in the nation for homelessness. So this is a really critical issue to address. And I think using incentives to help private property owners help be part of the solution is a really smart idea. But the underlying support systems in Vermont to serve homelessness are somewhat siloed and disparate and sometimes competing and complicated, and they can be challenging both to existing experienced service providers and housing providers, and it can be really confounding for private property owners. So I think what we're seeing is a need for companion funding for supportive services. I know that's not in this bill, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't include that in my comments. And then my last comment has to do with our home repair program, which is not included in this bill, but it's a well-established program with infrastructure already in place. And because it's CDBG funded, it does intersect with how money is allocated in the state. CDBG funding is available for housing development projects, for economic development projects, and for these home repair projects. And as the needs around housing development increase, we're seeing this resource getting squeezed on the home repair side. And this is a critical program. It's got a wonderful track record. It's got existing infrastructure. It's not brand new, and it just needs more capital. And so part of the concern is that we serve primarily seniors in this program, people that have some equity in their home, but not the cash flow for repairs. And we're seeing a trend of people in real housing instability. And we're afraid that we're down the line going to see a different face of homelessness, a senior face, somebody that doesn't have anywhere else to go. And so while I wasn't ready to do a full-blown presentation about the need for funding this program, I would advocate for another opportunity for those of us around the state to talk in more detail about this and how adding more capital to this program could really be a wonderful direction for solving the preservation issues. And
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. We're getting a little backed up. This was really valuable.
Thank you.
and
Okay.
more to follow. Maybe
Yeah.
Wendy and you and I could have a further conversation, Elizabeth. That would be great.
I would really value that. I appreciate your time. Thank you again for inviting me.
You're
Followed
followed.
by a mayor and a former speaker of the House. So
Thank you for your
we
work.
have lots of great folks coming in. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much.
So we have former Speaker Fecta on the line. He doesn't mind waiting as we're a little bit behind. So thank you so much for that. If you could hear us, and Mayor Lott, thank you also for your patience. We can give you your 15 minutes now if that still works. Thanks so much for waiting.
It was interesting to listen to Elizabeth, and I can be brief. Thank you all for your time this morning.
But then we'll have to do that.
So I had a chance to review the brief on the bill and want to just first share general support. Really pleased to see action on housing. We see this as the biggest challenge facing our residents in Winooski and frankly beyond our borders. So thanks for all your work on this and for including funding to resource municipalities to make changes to their regulations. I want to say that most of these measures are on the right track. We've seen success locally with some of similar items in here. So, we've increased density in our regulations. Think a duplex by right is a natural extension of ADUs by right. We've streamlined permitting, created development incentives, and are currently working on parking reductions. Reduced parking minimums and moving permit approvals to the extent possible to administrative approval process has absolutely reduced cost and increased new housing units in Winooski. This could work statewide. I want to share two comments. The bonus story for affordable housing, we have that in our regulations too. It hasn't been well utilized. My understanding is that, so we already allow 4 stories, and that moving up to 5 changes the construction necessary from wood to steel, which is more expensive. So it hasn't it's kind of been a wash, I think, for developers. So you might consider
Interesting point.
other incentives. Generally what we hear, parking waivers, permit waivers, money. And then the most important thing I want to get across is would love to see an incentive in here for 3-bedroom or larger housing. This has been like a critical problem. Just last week, we had a family displaced by a fire in Winooski. This is actually the 3rd incident this year. And we're talking about families who are more than 2 people. They cannot find new housing to move into. We settled a single refugee family over the past year. If we want to continue to welcome refugees, expand our workforce, have families sending kids to our schools, they need housing, and the 1 and 2 bedroom supply that we see actually getting built is not working. Also, new development tends to include these smaller units, so sometimes it's displacing existing housing of that size. We know that private developers aren't going to build 3-bedroom or larger on their own. Like, they have to get some sort of financial incentive to do it. I also want to note removing the duplication of water and sewer permitting is really critical. Really pleased to see that. Like, we have super robust permitting process around that in our towns already. That VLCT and the mayors have been asking for complete elimination of Act 250 review in designated downtowns. I think this is a good step. If there is appetite to go further, you might consider a temporary suspension versus just fully removing it from designated downtowns, like 2 to 3 years, see how much housing gets built, see if there is an environmental negative impact. It's hard for me to see the through line between building dense units in downtown Winooski or Burlington or Rutland and forest defragmentation. I think now is the time that you could maybe make some progress there, but what you have in there around water and sewer is really great, and I really hope that sticks. And I also just want to ask where you might be concerned about any of the items proposed here. Like, where do you anticipate pushback, and how can we help advocate with you?
That's a great question. Thanks so much, Mayor Lott. I think around the table, we're learning with others that while we knew we had a homelessness crisis, it's, per capita, the 2nd largest increase in homelessness in the country. We have the 2nd largest homeless population in the country. I will speak for myself. I have less concerns about this bill than others, but we're certainly trying to balance all issues we're hearing to make sure that, we do this in a way that doesn't create sprawl. I think the way to do that is to make sure Act 250 is included in the bill. Others think we should wait for another study. I don't know, mayors have been really strong on Act 250. So we'd love to hear, why Act 250 is a barrier for you in the most multicultural city in Vermont.
Yeah, we don't have a dedicated housing person right now, so I don't have any info on our most recent projects, but it's like a couple that what I've seen in the past is per unit for a project in Winooski, it's a couple $1,000s per unit of extra fees when we already do almost the exact same review. Minimum of 6 months spent in review when we can review a project in half that time. So there's a significant delay. And it's worse now because there's already such a delay in construction, like getting construction companies who can do the work or getting the materials. And it gets even more nitty gritty. Like, Vermont Public moved into the VSAC building in Winooski. They had to go through Act 250 review just to install a sign. So even like existing properties that are in the review area, if they want to make changes, if they wanted to expand or add new units or something, they are forced to keep going through that process. We already review for siting, architecture, signage, water, wastewater, like we're not sprawl. Winooski is 1 square mile of dense urban area, right? Like what we do within there is not impacting that. So it does feel very duplicative, and the delays that it adds, you know, there's the cost factor, but the time delays just really take a very long time to get new units added, which is why I'm suggesting a temporary suspension, because we really need to catch up. Like we're so far behind on the creation of new units. A short-term approach to speed up the process could help us actually get caught up, you know, without completely undoing it. And as we kind of close the gap on the need for new units, there's space to step back and maybe become more restrictive, but at least testing out, like during this crisis, can we speed up the process to get new units online?
Absolutely. Senator Clarkson.
Christine, thanks. You know, we're addressing and have addressed in the past duplicative permitting, which we're very sensitive to is a problem. And we don't want to do duplicative permitting. That seems like a total waste of everybody's time, particularly when there are eyes on the same issue with the local values and, you know, local interest and apply in the way that that community wants to apply them. I think I would love a list from you, if you were willing to send it to us, of the additional duplicative pieces.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure we're all as aware. I mean, we're clear on the water sewer hookup pieces, which we have tried to reduce, the water permitting, duplicative water pieces and sewer pieces. But if you'd be kind of just to send us a list of all the other duplicative permitting, that isn't just Act 250, it's other A&R stuff too, right? It's not all 250.
Yeah,
if you
absolutely.
that would be great.
Happy to do that.
Think that's part of what we're trying to get rid of. As long as a set of eyes is looking at it and making a decision that's thoughtful, I think that's critically important.
It's really great to have a mayor whose day job is as a data analyst as well. This is what makes you for mayor. You know, we've been looking at some of the data from Vermont Housing Finance Agency just to see who's keeping up with this like healthy level of vacancy. I know it's not the right type of housing, especially to meet the need of larger families, but Winooski might be the only place in the state, I don't know, where you're keeping that healthy level of vacancy. You're actually building enough units and enough units are turning over and coming online. Just so you know, if you look at their data on housing stock, you're at above 2% each decade of having available housing stock for people to buy. What other, you know, what are you, I mean, I get to drive through Winooski a lot and it's lovely, you know. What else do you want to tell us about, you know, Winooski, about, you know, it's always been the immigrant community. It's always had these needs and these changes. How is transit oriented housing going? Any trends you're seeing?
Well, we're seeing, unfortunately, we're seeing displacement. And we already have a problem with overcrowding, like large families living in units that aren't large enough. So while we may have people getting housed, when we do rental inspections, we're finding conditions that are not ideal. But what do you do in that scenario? Like, you know, that family doesn't have anywhere else to move to. So that's a challenge. And then with the way that rents are increasing, there has been turnover, like more investor buyers have purchased properties in Winooski, increased rent, either because they can or because their mortgage was so high over the last couple of years. And I'm hearing from residents at a level I have not in my early years in this role, saying like, I can't find anywhere to live, or I'm getting forced out of my current place. So even with like us building at a rate that others are not, it's not keeping up with the demand in the area.
Are you all trying to focus on immigrant and BIPOC home ownership in any way?
We have, established a housing trust fund that does have, what's the word I want? It's not incentive, but does prioritize that. We're actually rethinking that right now because it started with down payment assistance, and now we're hearing that like that's not really useful. We need an interest buy down because of the interest rates on mortgages. And then there's also some like navigation assistance that's required to help people through these programs. So, that's kind of unrelated to this, but like funding for AALV and USCRI would really help for them to expand capacity to support refugee families.
Yeah,
That's a great. I know if I let you talk long enough, something brilliant, more brilliant things. will
well, we,
um,
And we are expanding our own funding for language services, but these agencies already have connections in the community and are well positioned to do more.
Right. Any final questions for Mayor Lott? We would love to stay in touch, and the more specificity we get, I think many of us have read the Mayor's Coalition letter, but getting granular is going to help us get these things passed. They are big changes. I like the idea of a pilot or a sunset. Give some people some confidence, that we're maintaining the sort of Vermont standard for development.
Yeah,
So
I guess I do have a question. Hi, Mayor.
Hello.
The parking, it'd be very helpful because Winooski is a great example of a very dense community that is actually reducing parking.
Right.
So maybe if you could send us some information on how that's going and any advice that you have, because that is something that a lot of folks are concerned about.
but it
Right.
has also urban transportation options, which many
It
of our
does.
communities don't.
It does.
Have you, have
But then
you
also
tried
late into
to
the night.
think about transit incentives, been aggressive with, Green Mountain Transit on your needs?
Yeah, I mean, we have incentives like having the property provide bus passes or a bus shelter. That stuff has been a little bit useful, but it's the frequency of service is still a challenge for a lot of folks. But we do have, I think, at least 15% of our households don't own a car. So that's been something to balance with, like, what's that?
I think 15. Okay, 15.
15, yeah. So when we think about like, do you really need 2 parking spaces per unit? Often you do not. And we hear actually from residents saying that, like, why am I paying for parking that I don't need?
Interesting. All right. Well, this has been
thank you.
wonderful. Thanks so much, Mayor Lott. We really appreciate you taking the time, and
Thanks for having me. Yeah. I'll follow up with
thanks.
some information. I'll follow up with your committee staff. Thank you
That
so
would be
much.
the-
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that duplicative permits would be great.
Speaker Fecto, thanks so much for your patience.
No problem.
We are the
Thanks for having
Senate, so sometimes we keep speakers waiting, but
Speaker of what?
me. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Hey, that's right.
Thanks so much for being here. We had to shave a little time off. You still have 35 minutes, which I hope is a good amount of time. We really appreciate you being here, and we've heard really good things about Maine doing some of the changes we're contemplating in our bill. So thank you. And now you work for the governor. I understand.
I do. Yes. I've joined the darker side than the House from your perspective.
Right.
Well, thanks for having me before your committee this morning. Happy to be helpful however I can. As mentioned, I previously served in the legislature for 8 years, served as Speaker of the House, and now working for Governor Mills as Senior Advisor on Community Development. So I still have my hands very much involved on the conversation around housing. I'm going to run through the provisions of the bill that we passed in Maine. I've taken a look at the work you all are pursuing in Vermont, and excited to see a lot of overlap, and perhaps I can answer questions about how we were able to get to a point of consensus, which I know is always challenging when there's so many different interest, especially from the municipal community, which obviously in New England, we have this tremendous spirit of local control and trying to navigate respecting local control, but also recognizing that nationwide we're facing a housing crunch and we need more housing. Just for context, in Maine, Maine has the oldest housing stock in the nation. 1 in 5 renters in Maine pay more than half of their income towards housing costs. And our number one emission is the result of transportation. We have a lot of folks driving long distances to get to work on a daily basis. The other thing I think it's important to note, Maine has been developing roughly 250 units of subsidized housing on an annual basis since 2015. So, pretty low production. And our goal and our need is about 1,000 subsidized units of affordable housing. And that doesn't account for market rate housing. That's also very much, is also very important to the housing ecosystem as well. We really emphasize, we need housing of all types in Maine, but the affordable housing, the subsidized housing for low-income families has been really lagging behind. Good news is we made some really smart investments over the last couple of years, made some policy decisions that have increased production of those affordable units. We were at over 500 units in 2021, look to be about in the same place in 2022, maybe even nearing 600. So we've doubled that production from those earlier years, but we are still very far behind in terms of meeting that 1,000 unit goal that we have here in Maine. The bill that we passed last year, LD 2003, that I sponsored, was the result of the commission. We established a commission that really took a specific look at zoning and land use restrictions and how those restrictions might be artificially delaying housing from being built or preventing it from being built altogether. The bill essentially had 5 provisions. The first one, similar to the provision in the bill you all are looking at, effectively eliminated single-family zoning in Maine. The allowance in the bill is if there's an empty lot, a lot that doesn't have a house, someone could build a single-family house or a duplex if it's not in a growth area or served by public water and public sewer. If it's in a designated growth area according to a community's comprehensive plan, that person could build up to 4 units on that lot. We have left the decision to communities about whether or not if someone buys a lot that has an existing structure on it and they tear it down, if they get the permission to build up to 4 units or up to 2 units, depending on where it's located. So that will be a decision as communities change their ordinances to comply with this mandate. They will make the decision as to whether or not that would be allowable or not allowed. The second thing we did, and I should also say that provision in the bill also requires that a community not require more acreage for the second and third and fourth unit than they require for the first unit. So if you have if your town has a requirement that for 1 unit you have to have 1 acre, but then for the second unit they say you need 4 acres, that will no longer be allowed. They need to have the same multiplier for that first unit for the second unit. So under this law, that town, the hypothetical town, would then become 1 acre for 1 unit, 2 acres for 2 units, 3 acres for 3 units, and so on. So that's a pretty substantial change. We have some communities, we have one community that comes to mind right away that for 3 units or more requires 30 acres of land. You can imagine they are not building multi-units in that community. In fact, they've only sent out 40 permits for housing over the last decade. So some real challenges that we have across the state.
And Mr. Fecto, did you want to take questions on each section as we go?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, happy to.
Okay, Senator Clarkson.
I'm just curious how you built consensus around this number 1.
We fortunately had some pretty strong bipartisan support for this particular provision. we had members of both parties on the commission, and this was seen as a real step forward that allows people to make decisions with the land that they own for themselves within reason. 4 units also has a we had a member of the committee, a Republican member who of the commission rather, who is a landlord. She's been a practitioner in this field for a while, and she knows what financing you can access when you are building a structure that has 4 units versus 5 units. The funding mechanism changes pretty dramatically, and we felt like this is really about making sure that an anyday person, everyday people, not necessarily large developers, can make decisions about the land that they own. And I think that sort of libertarian, if you will, I don't know what you want to call it, maybe the New Hampshire's live free and die spirit. I don't know if we adopted it for a moment in Maine, but that notion of doing what you want with your land, I think really, rose
yes,
to prominence.
So what did you enable this just in your downtown and village centers in designated areas, or did you allow this town-wide? So how did you reduce sprawl with, how did you contain this?
Know that they had designated areas.
Yeah, so it can basically everywhere across the state now you can build up to a duplex. So single family lots become eligible for 2 units, but for up to be able to do the 4 units, you have to be either in a designated growth area, the terminology that we use here in Maine, that's designated within a comprehensive plan that a town adopts on their own, or they have access to public water, public sewer. Most of the time, if not nearly all the time, designated growth areas are in areas with public sewer and public water, and public sewer and public water is in designated growth areas. So that's how we distinguish.
How long has this been in place now?
It became effective. The law passed last year. The various provisions of the law will take effect on July 1st of this year, including this very provision. So this has not become. Towns are in the process of adopting the new ordinances to reflect the law.
Because we're hearing from some of our towns that already have done a bit of duplexing by right. There wasn't a huge land grab. There wasn't a huge changeover. This is that kind of homeowner flexibility. So, keep us informed. But I think, we're trying to also make sure people know they're not going to all of a sudden see a ton of development overnight.
That depends on where you are. In York County, they seem to be building condos hand over fist, but I think they're more vacation and retirement second homes. But I believe I was told York was the fastest growing county either in New England or the country a couple of years ago. So there's a lot of growth in that. They're commuting to Boston from there, which is very different than.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure in southern Maine. I live in York County as a result of what's happening in Portland. Portland really grew pretty quickly, and they have in many ways run out of space. It's also become very unaffordable for a lot of families. And so as people have left Portland, the ripple effect has been in surrounding communities. York County certainly getting the brunt of those folks. We also we've had an experience with domestic migration that we haven't had in quite a while. We were in the top 10 in 2020 and 2021 for folks moving from other states to our state, and we had a net migration, I think, of around 17,000 or so. So we're experiencing a very unique circumstance in Maine at the moment, which we haven't in quite a while, and that is people are moving here, and that's increasing. Increasing the demand. Yeah, and the majority of these people are under the age of 45, which is encouraging because we are the oldest state in the country, and so definitely have been trying to figure out how we can get more people. But we definitely did not anticipate. I don't think we could have anticipated how quickly folks are moving here and what kind of strain that's applying now to our housing stock.
Right. Vermont and Maine often trade certain distinctions, the whitest, the oldest,
Yes.
you know, and
Oh,
also
a few
the
decimals
largest
off,
number-
yes.
Right, and the largest number of vacation homes as well, you know, so I mean, I think we both share that concern about having enough starter homes and available housing for families and residents is, I'll let you continue going through the bill, but we're just keeping that in mind as well, that we need to layer on outside of this bill a way to make sure that, you know, we somehow make sure residents are benefiting from the housing growth as well.
Yeah, and we didn't tackle short-term rentals in this particular bill. A new commission was established this past summer in 2022 to look at short-term rental policy, and there were some recommendations offered by that commission, and a new joint select committee was established on the issue of housing. And so I think they'll be having conversations about that, but it's a very difficult nut to crack, because obviously so many of communities across Maine, Vermont depend on tourism, and short-term rentals are certainly part of that ecosystem. I think the question is, how do you create the proper balance where, yes, you have short-term rentals, but you don't have so many short-term rentals that are converting long-term housing into short-term housing on a pretty rapid basis.
That's it. So,
Yeah, we'll let you continue.
yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. You were on number 2.
Sorry. So the second allowance was ADUs, which sounds like you all have an ADU by right allowance already. So that's basically what we adopted as well. I see there's some conversation around parking requirements around ADUs and I think duplexes in the legislation you're looking at. We basically said that if someone adds an ADU, you can't require more parking than you require for the primary structure on the lot. So if there's a single family home on the lot already, the town can't then say, oh, you need 2 more parking spots because you're building an ADU. If the requirement for that primary structure is 2, then the requirement remains 2. It doesn't get upped. And so we felt like it was important not to try to give a backdoor way of preventing ADUs from being built. I should also note that some communities in Maine are doing some creative things around this new ADU allowance. The town of Kittery and the city of Auburn are both offering grants to citizens to build ADUs. Kittery is offering a $50,000 grant, and Auburn is offering a $30,000 grant. So pretty substantial dollars to help citizens build ADUs in their communities. Kittery loosened its restrictions on ADUs prior to this bill being passed last year, and since that time they have 33 permits out for ADU construction in the town of Kittery, which is a pretty good number given how the short period of time between their loosening restrictions and those permits being issued. So
we may now have something similar.
Good things happening on that front. The city of Auburn is also adopting a policy that will pre-approve some basically pre-baked floor plans for ADUs. I think they're going to have 8 variations, and those will not require planning board approval. They'll just simply get permitted by the permitting office. So I think that's also a great model for local communities to follow, is making it as easy as possible for residents to build an ADU, not needing an architect to create a plan and everything. So that's some good stuff. The third provision in the bill, I guess I don't know if you have any questions on that. It's pretty straightforward and not.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Thank you. On the ADUs, are most of them internal to the building or external to the building?
So we allowed for any combination thereof. So they can actually put, if so we only created this permission we only created this mandate for lots that have a single family home already. So we didn't dive into, we had conversations about allowing ADUs where there might be a duplex already. There was a lot of pushback. And so in the sausage grinder, we ended up just moving forward with having a single family home being allowed to add an accessory dwelling unit. But oddly enough, the law does allow for someone to convert, for example, an attic into an ADU, or converting the top of a garage into an ADU, and also adding an attached ADU to the house, or a detached ADU to the house. So they can have essentially two ADUs get added on the lot with a single family home, and it can be attached, detached, or within the existing structure.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sorry, my question was, which are you actually seeing get built?
Oh,
The-
sorry. I think
Or the, I didn't ask it well.
I think we're seeing a lot of attached structures, and also a lot of garage conversions seem to be pretty common. I visited an ADU in the town of Wells here in New York, single family neighborhood. You drive down the street, you would never know that they put an ADU on this house until you drive up the driveway, and there it is on the back attached to the house. And this was a family whose mom was experiencing early signs of dementia. They looked at many options, assisted living and so forth, as they tried to sell her home. And they ultimately determined that it was the least expensive option to add an ADU to their existing home. And so now mom is there with her daughter and her granddaughter, who also lives there. And so just a really great story, and still creating some independent living, but also having family who can be there to support. There was a New York Times article last week, I don't know if you all saw it, about it was the headline was something like the housing choice that older adults actually like, and the story was all about ADUs. So great stuff.
Yeah, it's
Thank
on
you.
our desks.
Okay, good,
Yeah, we
good,
appreciate
perfect.
that. Yeah.
Awesome. So the other provision was density bonuses. We created an allowance of 2.5 times the density that a community has if the developer agrees to 50% of the units meeting 80 to 120% of AMI. And so we
80
don't,
to 120.
yeah, 80 to 120.
Yeah.
And then they also would be in a restricted covenant for, I think, a period of 30 years, meeting that affordability requirement. The interesting thing about this is we are taking the base density of the community. So we're not mandating what the density is, but we're saying whatever your density is, so this will vary town by town, it will be 2.5 times that density. So we're taking, I think this is where we had some success, was we weren't in every instance mandating what communities need to do. We were taking what they already had, and sort of like a Lego, making our piece fit on top of their existing rules and ordinances. So I think that's why the density bonus was successful. Any questions on that
Fourth
one?
piece.
Yep, fourth piece.
No, that's just interesting. I'd like to see that language. We'll get it from NCSL or something.
Yeah, I can definitely pass it along to I think the person who emailed me about this meeting. And I'm sure that guy. There we go. Perfect. The fourth piece was a Fair Housing Act provision. So we took language from Connecticut that adopted a provision that said you needed to affirmatively further fair housing requirements. We also added in our own Maine Human Rights Act in terms of zoning. So this will be interesting. We're not really quite clear how this will play out in practice, but we have seen some decisions from the Connecticut Supreme Court based on that law, striking down various zoning provisions across in the state of Connecticut because they conflict with the spirit of the Fair Housing Act. And in our case, it would not only just be the Fair Housing Act, but also the Maine Human Rights Act. So we're interested in seeing how that will play out. But it was really important for us that we recognize that a lot of zoning provisions are the result of redlining and many, many years of a focus on creating segregated communities. We also added a requirement that the state establish a housing production goal, and we are setting out over the next couple of months in probably the most comprehensive study of Maine's housing needs in our state's history. And we're hoping to have those results by the fall. But it will give not only a production goal statewide, but it will also give production goals by region, which I think will be helpful for communities thinking about, what is the need in our various communities. I think it will also help us mitigate this notion that housing is only needed in Southern Maine, because we know that there are needs for housing across our state. I'm sure you all have similar arguments being made that this is maybe just a Burlington region issue, or and so forth. But I think we know very well that housing is needed everywhere.
You seem like a data guy. You're working for the governor now. We're trying to figure out what our data section looks like. What kind of data should we collect? How easy it is to get that information. We were looking, for example, AirDNA is something our housing organizations can purchase to understand short-term rentals and the length of rentals. Are you finding any hacks or any really particular language around data collection is important?
I actually just talked to a GPCOG, Greater Portland Council of Governments yesterday. They're actually beta testing something from MIT around the short-term rental piece. They have a community in Southern Maine that's beta testing it for them. So I might be able to build a connection there and see what stage that data is in, but it seems more comprehensive than what's currently available to communities for pulling down the data on short-term rentals, because I think it also compares it to the town information as well. For example, like have there been 911 calls to the residents because of noise complaints or something? It will immediately flag the address for things like that. So that's definitely creative. I don't know if you've connected with Up for Growth, but they produce an annual underproduction report. And so you could go to their website right now and see, based on the data that they pulled for your state, where they think your underproduction is. And they definitely are a helpful resource. We definitely relied on them for the work that we did here in Maine, and they have a lot of data that they have collected and used to establish what that underproduction number is in each state.
Great, Senator Clarkson.
Thanks, Ron. This is super helpful. It's really a pleasure to hear you chat about this and what Maine's accomplished. And I'm so proud of you, particularly getting consensus on it, because housing should not be a divisive issue here. I guess one of my questions is, do you currently have a housing registry in Maine? Are you have a rental registry or a housing registry so that you know where all the housing is? Or is this one of the housing production goals, is to have a region by region statewide data on where all the housing is, what types of units, et cetera, are so that you know where everything is? Yeah,
we don't currently have a registry. There's legislation that's been submitted this session to establish a registry. So we'll see where that that proposal goes, but we currently do not have a registry. And we're pretty reliant on communities providing us with information. And our goal is that there'll be a pretty high response rate with the study being conducted by a national firm that we've hired to provide more data, not just about what the current housing stock looks like, but also how many permits are out there in production. There's census collects some data on that, but it's got a lot of holes.
Right. Well, I'd love to stay in touch about the housing production goals and what the goals are in terms of what Maine gets back in terms of understanding and data about rental and owned homes. I mean, just all the housing. And
definitely.
Where you end up.
Yeah,
Thanks.
And once the report is complete, I'd be happy to send it to you too, so you have at least a roadmap for what our report looks like, and maybe some avenues you want to pursue as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Awesome. And then finally, the other provision in the bill that actually ended up in the budget but not in the bill was related to the the creation of a housing opportunity fund. This dedicated $2.5 million per year to providing grants to municipalities as well as service agencies such as a COG to provide technical assistance to communities so that they can first of all make the changes that are necessary based on this new state mandate, but also to go beyond the provisions of 2003. Obviously, this bill that I passed and sponsored and passed did not tackle everything. There were things that we recommended from the commission that ultimately got cut out as a result of compromise and the work that we do in lawmaking. But there are communities that are excited about the conversation, and they want to figure out how they can build consensus in their own communities about different changes that we did not make, such as parking requirements statewide. Like we didn't dive into should there be a blanket statute related to what communities are allowed to enforce around parking requirements. It seemed like probably something ultimately that they would want to make decisions on locally. Minimum lot size requirements, we didn't dive into that, but we want to see communities like the one I mentioned earlier make some changes around that as well, and many other aspects of this housing conversation. And so these funds will be deployed in helping communities have those conversations, and also having service providers provide that technical assistance on the ground. So, and we also, under the bill, hired 2 new employees at the Department of Economic and Community Development who are staffed to, first of all, implement the law, but secondly, be of assistance to communities. We know that communities come in different shapes and sizes across the state of Maine, and certainly for Vermont as well. And many towns don't have planners. They don't have the resources that they can rely on with internal staff to make these decisions, or to contemplate how they can make housing production more favorable for their community. And these 2 folks that we've hired now will be a resource for communities who, especially the ones who don't have those resources on their staffs already. So with that, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We still have 5 minutes for questions, and I want to go to people who have it. Senator Cummings. Senator Cummings probably travels the most to Maine. I don't know.
I'm about to become a Maine business person producing revenue, I hope, for you. I
Great.
rented an antique section in Kennebunk.
Oh, nice.
But I do get there in regularity.
I'm in Biddeford, so not too far away from you.
Well, my daughter went to uni.
Okay, great.
That's how we started going there. She had to rent a cottage on Goose Rocks Beach.
Not a bad place to be. Although a little not as fun in the winter as it is in the summer, but still very beautiful. So
it is very beautiful.
Are you experiencing the same cold spell that we are today?
Yeah. Definitely concerned about folks who are, especially those who are unsheltered, and trying to make sure we get more places open so that they can stay warm.
Right. Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, Ryan, it's so funny how the synergy of things happens here in the Northeast, but we are in the same process of figuring out how we can roll out more technical assistance to our underserved communities, or our communities who've just chosen not to have town managers or planners or zoning people. So it's so funny, we're looking at $3 million to do something quite similar, and we're in the process of indexing and figuring out how we want to weigh those and how we identify them. So it's so curious that we're all doing the same thing at the same time. For us, the trigger was the federal money, and how we enable smaller communities to access money and fulfill some vision, and help encourage them to do some of the visioning work around what do they want to be, and where do they want to go, and how do we help them get there.
Yeah, and we sort of have this going on in 2 buckets, because we've deployed a lot of funding to communities around technical assistance for planning for climate change and resilience. And so those dollars are going out, and we have a team working on that stuff. And now we'll have these other these other dollars going out to help with planning for how you make sure that your community can support the number of families that need housing in our state. So there are two things happening at once, and so a lot of good work, and definitely a lot of need, because every community is resourced differently, and some communities have very few resources. And I should have mentioned it at the top. There are 200 communities in Maine that don't have zoning at all. They have no requirements. So there's also that aspect of things. We also have a statewide shoreline zoning law. We apply shoreline zoning requirements to all the provisions in the bill, so they still have to meet those things. Obviously concerned about protecting our natural resources, and also we also provide an exemption for subdivisions because they often have covenants, and so we didn't want to say we didn't want to dive into this issue of allowing a subdivision to have an ADU when the covenant says they can't. It was probably going to get pretty messy, and it wasn't worth the fight on that aspect. I don't know what your subdivision law looks like. Ours is pretty complex and a mess, and so we wanted to steer clear of subdivision.
I think we're navigating into dark waters everywhere in this bill.
I know.
Yes.
It's very ambitious.
Yeah.
So 2 questions. Is Maine a Dillon's rule state? And I would, what you said about the town that has the 34 acres, I think you said, for 4 units, is that the kind of thing that they may not have been aware that they had, or? And
No, I think they're well aware of the fact that they have that requirement.
Okay. So
Yeah.
is it a Dillon's rule state?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Senator Clarkson, Senator Brock, I didn't see her.
You had mentioned that you had done some rewriting or writing to deal with potential of discrimination, and that you had looked at Connecticut that also had given you some materials. I wonder if you could just tell us briefly about that and whether or not any of that material might be available to us.
Yeah, so Connecticut passed a law, I think in 2018, that was promoted by the organization Desegregate Connecticut, Desegregate CT, and so we utilized the same language, almost verbatim, that Connecticut had adopted in this law, that effectively says, zoning adopted by communities must affirmatively further the Fair Housing Act, and in our case, we added the Maine Human Rights Act as well, which has some variation from the federal law. So, in essence, saying, your zoning cannot be discriminatory, and it's obviously a very, very much a legal provision. It may not have any applicability to a community until their zoning is challenged in the court of law. But we wanted to make sure that if someone felt like the zoning was discriminatory, that they had a provision in law that they could leverage to challenge the local ordinance.
Was there any definition or other detail to define what discrimination means in this context? Or is it it relies entirely on the Fair Housing Act's language, so it's just basically a re-reference to the Fair Housing Act. And I can pull up. Let me see if I can pull up what we did here. So the way the language read in our bill is, a municipality shall ensure that ordinances and regulations are designed to affirmatively further the purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act, 42 United States Code, Chapter 45 as amended, and the Maine Human Rights Act to achieve the statewide or regional housing production goal.
So that's We're running low on time. I
Yeah.
wanted to give him a chance to offer final.
Yeah, any
words of
final, and
wisdom.
would just love to know what your final vote was on this bill, and because consensus is what we strive for, and I'm impressed you ended up passing this as constructively and productively as you did.
It's a very good question. So we passed it in committee on a divided report, unfortunately. There was no bipartisan consensus in committee, but we knew outside of the committee we had supporters on both sides of the aisle, and so it passed in the House 68-43 with a number of members from both sides of the aisle supporting it. I think I lost one of my members, so not all. I didn't get every single one of my colleagues in the House. And then, that was in the enactment vote, and then in the Senate it passed 20-13 with, I think, 2 Republicans supporting it.
Senator Brock will have the last word as our lone Republican on the committee. We're a blue legislature and a very popular Republican governor, as you may know. And yeah.
My question is, of those people who were opposed, what were the arguments that you heard in opposition?
Heavily on the local control aspect. I mean, this in Maine, we have a provision that if you're going to do a municipal mandate, you need 2/3 vote, or you have to fund whatever the cost of the mandate is. And so we got around the 2/3 vote by funding the cost of the municipal mandate. But as you can imagine, it's challenging to pass legislation that's telling communities what to do when the spirit of local control is so strong. I think ultimately colleagues on both sides of the aisle have felt from their constituencies the challenges that communities face with housing. I mean, we had the town of Rockland up the mid coast here in Maine had been searching for a new police chief. They offered the job to someone from out of state. He came looking for housing in the Rockland area, could not find housing, rescinded his offer, and they lost, strong candidate to be their police chief. And we're hearing this from communities across the state that say, can't find teachers, can't find public works, can't find firefighters, can't find police officers. And so I think the notion of local control is important, and I certainly respect it. And we tried to build a bill that gave as much power to the communities to still be making decisions, but in coordination with this legislation. But we also know that we've had local zoning ordinances for a long time, and they have not done the job of building a climate where housing can be built, where there are not barriers in place of developers and citizens to do what they need to build housing for their neighbors. And that I think that sentiment of empowering people, everyday people, not just developers, not just corporations, but everyday people to be a part of the solution. I think that sentiment overcame this notion that local control in and of itself is so important that we can't touch it.
Yeah, that's
Got it.
great.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think we're used to cold comfort up here in northern New England, but it's really nice to know that we're facing the same challenges and coming to the same conclusions about what the right solutions are. So we really appreciate your time and your work. I'm also very fond of Speaker Talbot Ross. So, we love to stay in touch with what you all are doing. And thank you for taking all this time, our best to your colleagues and to your governor. And we'll look forward to staying in touch through Scott, who emailed you. And
Thanks.
we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
Stay
Yeah, good
warm.
luck.
Stay warm.
Swimming.
Stay warm.
Only for 2 days. It's going up to 40 degrees.
Yeah, it'll be fine. We'll survive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just take a deep breath for 2 days.
Thank
Not
you so
outside.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
So we will